Hello coders, my name is Darren with Renaissance Coders and thank you for joining us for this tutorial on Unity 3D. Today we're going to be talking about materials in Unity 3D. It's an absolutely essential aspect of any sort of game engine, and today we're going to cover what it is that they are and what it is that they do. Alright, so you might have heard of materials, you might have not have. They're absolutely essential, as I stated before, and you could be using Unity for months now and not even know what a material is, because Unity will place materials on your game objects by default, and so you won't even know what your object would look like without the material on it. Okay, so it's hard to really appreciate what the material does for you until you actually start getting into it. So let's talk about what a material is. A material is a sequence of colors that get mapped to the vertices of a game object. Okay, so we can think of materials as clothing. Materials will actually wrap around an object to represent what we want the object to look like in our games. These clothes could be better known as textures, and multiple textures can be used on one material. So some common textures that we use with our materials are known as albedo, normal, and ambient occlusion, but of course there are many, many more. Albedo textures are basically the base color that we want our object to look like. So imagine that we have a box, okay, and this box has it's a wood plank box, so we have several say 2x4s going in horizontal and vertical directions, even diagonal directions on our box, and just imagine what that would look like. And what I want you to do is imagine what that would look like without any sort of shadows or any crevices, and that's what your albedo is going to be. It's not going to represent any light or any shadow. It's just going to be the base color of that box texture. Now our normal map, our normal texture is going to be used to define maybe you'll have some crevices or you'll have some cracks in that wood. And whenever we apply the normal map will utilize light and give us some tricks that will make those crevices and those cracks appear to be real and have real depth. The ambient occlusion texture will emulate real shadows on our game object, assuming that every side of the game object is lit evenly. Alright, and we'll actually provide examples for each one of these textures and how it'll look on our materials. Okay, so how do the textures get onto the object? Well, without going into too much detail, this is one of those things that can be very complicated, but I'll try to give you guys a brief overview of how it works. So a 3D modeler will create what is known as a UV map onto their model. And a UV map is a 2D representation of all of the vertices on the game object. So imagine you have a sphere, and of course the sphere has depth because it is a 3D object, and what the UV map will do is represent all of those vertices on a 2D plane. Now once we have this representation of our vertices, we can draw our textures onto the UV map using some sort of image editor like GIMP or Photoshop. And once these textures are created, there's nothing really left for us to do. Unity will import the object with the UV map, and any sort of textures that get placed onto the material for that object will automatically get mapped to the UV map. Alright, so once the textures are assigned to the UV, a shader program is run to describe how the textures will be displayed, how they'll be rendered in the game world. And I'm not going to talk about what shaders are in this tutorial, other than they relate closely and they work together closely with materials. Now in the next tutorial I'm going to talk about shaders. I'll provide a link to that in the top right hand corner, so go ahead and check that out when you're done with this tutorial. Alright, so I've covered what materials are and how we can actually, or how the engine will actually get the textures onto the object using materials. Let's go ahead and create a material for ourselves and talk about different ways we can manipulate it. Alright, so let's go into Unity. The first thing I want to do is, since I'm going to be using some of Unity's standard asset textures, I want to show you guys where you guys can get the same textures that I'll be using for this demonstration. So you'll go up to Assets and you'll go to Import Package, and then you'll select Environment. It'll decompress. You give it a minute, and then it'll prompt you with a list of assets that will get added to your project. So I've already imported it, so we won't see anything here. But if you haven't imported it yet, you'll see a long list of textures and other assets that you can import. So you'll just select import and wait for that to load. Okay, once you have that, let's go ahead and create our material. Actually, first we need to create an object to put our material on. So I'll go up to the hierarchy, I'll right click and go to 3D object and cube. And here we have our cube object. Okay, now as I said before, you could be using Unity for several months now and still not know what a material is because they automatically put one on there for you. Now, to show you what the game object looks like without a material and to show you why you should appreciate what materials do, you can go up to your mesh renderer for your object, open up the materials section, and click on the dot next to element 0. So we click on that dot, we come over here and we can select none. So now we won't have a material on our object. And as you can see, it's this really bright neon pink sort of magenta color. It's really unpleasant to look at. And after seeing this, it'll help you appreciate what the material does because the material actually adds color. It gives you this sort of drop-off shadow effect, so it looks a little bit more realistic, and that's just the most basic type of material. Okay, so let's create our material. We'll go to right-click in the project pane, go to Create, and select Material. I'll call this our box mat. Okay, so once we have our box mat selected, we can go over to the inspector and you'll see that we have all of these different options. Now what I want to go ahead and do is first drag the box mat onto the game object that we want the material to be used on. So I just did that there. Okay, and now you can see after clicking on the box material, we have all of these different texture settings that we can add to each one of these fields. So we have a field for albedo, metallic, normal, height. We have all of these different textures that we can add to our material to represent how we want it to look. Now I said before that the most common ones were albedo, normal, and occlusion, so I'm going to cover those in this demonstration. Let's first go to our albedo texture and let's see if we can find an albedo texture for this. Now remember, albedo is going to be the base color. It's not going to represent any sort of shadows or it's not going to represent any depth or anything like that. So what I want to do is select cap 01. And again, this is Unity's default asset that I got from the imported assets section. Okay, and here we have our base albedo texture, and it's actually quite a nice texture. It's very detailed, so it's going to be able to whenever we add a normal map to this, it's going to blend well. It's going to represent the crevices and all the areas, all the opportunity for shadow very nicely. Okay, so let's add our normal map. Remember, the normal map is going to be what really accentuates the shadows on our objects. So I'll click normal map and then I'll run through my assets. Now I want to pick a normal map that was created from the albedo texture. And as you can see here next to cap01 we have cap01 normal, which was provided by Unity. And I'm going to click that and just look at the game object as I click it and just watch how it changes. Okay, so you guys can see how much of a difference that was just by adding the normal map, and it looks like each one of these little rings on our cap actually looks like it's sort of getting pushed out from the 2D plane. Okay, so one of the cool things in Unity 5 that we can do with our normal map is determine how much of the normal map we want to be active. So 0 being completely inactive and 1 being the most active, we can modify this to bring the normal map down and adjust it to where we want it to be. So as I modify this 0, negative, it's a -1. Of course you can go over 1, but that's a little bit overboard. So staying within -1 to 1 is probably going to be your best bet, but we can essentially, by modifying this value, determine how much of the normal map we want to be affecting this material. Okay, so at 0 it's almost like it's basically just the albedo, and then I'll bring it up to around 0.7, and that's actually a pretty good good looking tree cap to me. Okay, and this is all done again using it's using materials and shaders. Okay, and we're going to be talking about shaders in the next tutorial. All right, now Unity doesn't provide us with an occlusion map for this, but I did create my own 3D object for you guys, and I created an ambient occlusion map for it, so I can show you guys what the ambient occlusion actually does. Okay, so here is my, sorry, give me 1 second here. Okay, so here is my game object that I created. It has an ambient occlusion already on it. And as you can see, it's just a box with some crevices inside of it going through the middle. And remember, what the occlusion map does is it'll actually represent what real shadows would look like on the object if it was just sitting in a well lit room. Okay, so essentially what it's going to be doing is giving us a little bit more realism to our game objects. And I'll show you guys that right here. So I created this material the same way that I created the last one, only this time I just added my occlusion map to it right here. Okay, so this is the occlusion map I'm using, and I'm sorry that I can't give this one to you guys, but it doesn't really matter. It's just showing you guys how the occlusion affects our game objects. Okay, so right now it's at 0, so it's as if I don't have any occlusion map on it. But as I increase this up to 1, just look at the center crevices of the object, and you can see they sort of start to darken. And what this is doing is it's sort of emulating what shadows would look like on this game object if it was just sitting in a well-lit room. And I'll go ahead and just bring it to 0 and back to 1 a couple times so you guys can see what it's doing. And essentially, in my opinion at least, it makes the game object look a little bit more realistic. And it's really simple to create the occlusion map. There's plenty of tutorials out there, but it's basically if you are familiar with 3D modeling, you click a couple buttons and it self-generates the map for you. Okay, that's going to wrap up this tutorial where we talked about what materials were and how we could use them. We created our own material and modified some of the textures on them. Talked about albedo, normal, and occlusion maps, and those are some of the most common ones that you'll be using most frequently in Unity. In the next tutorial, we're going to be talking about shaders, which work very closely with materials. So I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. If you like this video, drop a like, subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.